And get started. Welcome to Drupal GovCon, and thanks for picking this for your first session. Hopefully this will be some good info for you. I do want to give you just a quick disclaimer. This is a beginner session, but it's a back-end beginner session, so we're going to be looking at a lot of more sort of the back-end technologies you need to run Drupal 8 as opposed to doing like step-by-step, here's how you use Drupal 8. So if that is not the session you're looking for, this might not be the right room for you. My name is Mike Madison. I'm a technical architect at Acquia, which means that most of the time I'm designing solutions for clients and then overseeing the implementation of those solutions. Prior to being at Acquia, though, I was a freelancer, and then I actually worked at a national laboratory. So I've had a lot of years at government organizations, working directly with government clients. And this talk is really about my experience over the last 3-ish years, sort of transitioning from an all Drupal 7 workflow into an all Drupal 8 workflow. And prior to doing Drupal, I did some other open source PHP stuff, but that's not going to have a whole lot of bearing on what we're talking about today. So, the main reason I wanted to give this talk is that Drupal 8 itself is really pretty easy to use, right? I mean, so how many people in here have done something with Drupal, any version of Drupal? Hey, you're all highly qualified to use Drupal 8. Congratulations. The problem is, in my experience anyway, was that getting started with Drupal 8 was pretty difficult, right? Once you get there, it's not that bad. It's the getting there that's problematic. And it's particularly problematic if you're at an organization that doesn't specialize in web hosting or server administration. Often, right? Government clients, government organizations, freelancers, these are sometimes the situation you're in. So the associated technologies surrounding Drupal 8 are usually the things, at least again in my experience, that are going to really slow down that forward progress and stop you from making successful strides. So here's kind of our agenda today. We are going to look, like I said, at some Drupal 8 stuff specifically, but very little of my agenda today is going to be just explicitly Drupal 8. It's mostly all of the stuff that I think you need to know to be successful with Drupal 8. Also, my slides are already posted on the session page on the GovCon website. So as you're taking notes, feel free to just pull those up for your own reference. So I wanted to start with a confession today. I actually forgot about this. And back in 2005, when I was first learning PHP, I looked at Drupal and I'm like, no, just no. And that's why I spent the first 4 years of my career doing WordPress. And as I eventually learned Drupal and eventually led teams of Drupal developers, I kind of forgot about that initial learning curve, right? Because my job was to make it easy for people to use Drupal. My job was to help them learn incrementally without trying to grab the whole thing at the same time. So when I jumped in and started trying to figure out how to work with Drupal 8, it took me a little bit, but I remembered, this is not the first time I've hit that learning curve, right? I've had to deal with this before. And when I finally realized that by incrementally looking at everything instead of just trying to grab Drupal 8, it's much more successful, right? So how many of you have been to DrupalCon before? Excellent. My experience with this is just so much energy, so much excitement. I just want to go out and use whatever cool thing Dries talked about that year, right? There's all these really great buzzwords that come out of any DrupalCon, and they're right. This is exactly what Drupal 8 is. There's no hand-waving going on here. But to really get in and use Drupal 8, you have to have something that helps you run it. And when I was at the National Lab, what I really found was that Drupal is that tiny little sliver at the top. And that's not to say in my day-to-day now that I'm using Drupal 8 full-time that I don't run into problems. I do every day. But when I was first trying to get started, I had so much other crap going on that I didn't actually get into the Drupal problems. So this is a lot of what we're going to talk about today, right? How do we get an environment up and running? How do you use Composer? What do you do with object-oriented PHP and IDEs? And how do you sort of solve these problems so you can get far enough into sort of the real issues that I think you're going to have day to day? When I started working with Drupal 8, this was kind of my situation. I had a bunch of shared development environments. We didn't have any locals. All of those were running PHP 5.3. If you've looked at Drupal 8's requirements, you have to have at least PHP 5.6, so that was a pretty significant blocker. The organization I worked for had a really great server team that knew very little about Drupal. So we had a development team trying to tell the server administrators how to set up web servers, and that just did not go very well. I did not have a great deal of experience with dependency management, debuggers, or IDEs. They don't teach that in English degrees. And you know, if you've used Drupal 6, Drupal 7, you didn't really need them, right? You don't need an IDE if you're not using object-oriented code. So trying to step into this new scenario was a challenge, to say the least. So let's start off with locals and why they're so important. One of the challenges I've found with having a team that isn't a team of server administrators is you say, okay, I need you to go set up your local. You end up with Mac and Linux and PC. You end up with different versions of PHP. You end up with different versions of MySQL. Everybody's got something slightly different. And of course, a cloud environment does fix that, right? If everybody's working on the same server, if you're on the cloud, you know it's all the same. But if you're working on the cloud, then you've got a much better chance of somebody breaking that environment. If you're a team that works on multiple projects, each of those projects is probably going to have slightly different dependencies. Trying to do multiple versions of PHP on the same web server, for example, that just never ends very well. So I want to tell you about an open source project that Acquia supports called BLT, or the Build and Launch Tool. And the whole purpose of BLT is to help make this local problem infinitely simpler for you. What BLT does is it provides a standardized template for local web development. This helps you manage all of the dependencies on a project. This helps you manage a virtual machine for the project. And this also helps ensure that each person on your team, regardless of their skill level, has the exact same version of everything. So same version of PHP, same version of MySQL, same BHAT, same PHP unit, everything that you need to be successful. BLT also gives you a common set of authoring commands and interactions, right? So if you want to set up, let's say, a site that exactly mirrors your staging site, you need to sync the database, you need to update the database, you need to import configuration. You've got each of these steps that you want to take to make sure that your local exactly matches your staging site. BLT actually helps chain those commands together for you, so you run one command instead of like 7 commands. BLT gives you a lot of other things that help support best practices. So for example, get hooks. This is really nice to make sure that everybody's actually committing the same way, writing the same commit messages, making sure that people are writing quality code. You don't want bad code in your repository. And it also helps tie into things like continuous builds, automated deployments, etc. BLT, however, does not do anything with Drupal itself. So it's only there to help support that local environment. So it doesn't get into like workflow, admin experience stuff. Acquia does provide a distribution called Lightning. That's open source. It helps with some of those things. BLT does help with front end. So if you're doing SASS or JavaScript that needs to be compiled, BLT has commands for that. But it doesn't actually provide a base theme. And Drupal VM would be the preferred local environment. And I'm not going to go too much deeper into this today, other than to tell you that, it's really not hard to use. Literally, once you get BLT set up for your project, if you want somebody to start working on that project, there's like 4 commands they have to run. It's like get clone, composer install, BLT VM. We'll talk more about this as we go today. But I also want to just mention that I'm going to do a real deep dive into BLT tomorrow afternoon. So if you're potentially interested in this, 2 o'clock, I don't know exactly where it's going to be. It'll shift based on the schedule. But we'll talk more about this tomorrow. The takeaway here is that locals can be challenging if you don't have some sort of framework to help you. There are a couple of other talks in the DevOps track going on this week about Docker and Doxel, other technologies that you could use. But I think it's a really important first step to figure out your environment before you get too far into Drupal 8. Right? And you can go out, like right now, literally, you can go to Simply Test Me, you can go to Acquia, there are other organizations that will give you an environment that you can go play with Drupal 8. And if your end goal is to just learn Drupal 8, do that, please, it's worth your time. But if you're thinking about, how do I get my team transitioned from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8? How do I get my shop running Drupal 8 all day, every day, successfully? Getting working environments that you have control over, that you understand, that your team can use, is a really critical first step to making that leap. And if you don't invest that time and energy up front, I think you're going to find really rapidly that you're building things that you can't support. You can't do rapid updates. You can't do security updates as quickly as you need to do. You don't have the right integrations to be successful long term. So the next big thing I want to talk a little bit about is dependency management. I had not used Composer before. Composer is not necessarily a Drupal thing, but it is a Symfony thing. It is a PHP thing. If you've worked with front-end technologies, you might have seen NPM or Yarn. There are many different dependency managers out there. But Composer itself is highly, highly integrated into Drupal 8. One of my earliest experiences with this was trying to get Search API working with Drupal 8. All of our sites relied on Solar, and I could get Search API to turn on, and then anytime I tried to do anything with it, the whole site would fatal error, and it would just die. And I'm like, is this module broken? What's going on? No, that was user error, because Search API in Drupal 8 actually requires the Solarium PHP library. And no modules, or very few modules in Drupal 8, actually come shipped with all of their dependencies, right? Because Composer manages the dependencies for you. So getting to know Composer early on will help you actually take advantage of the Drupal community and start using Contrib again. Because a lot of stuff that at first glance looks like it doesn't work actually works fine if you actually install the dependencies and set it up properly. So let's take a look at how Composer works. So Composer has an inventory file. This is an example of the Drupal GovCon inventory file. You can actually go out to GitHub and see this if you're interested. And each of these items here is a Drupal module or some sort of library that we're using. So like BLT's here, here's Lightning, capture, recapture, web form, etc. Lots of familiar faces. And what you do with Composer is you basically run a simple command. So in this case, I'm adding the honeypot module. You run a Composer require. The Drupal/honeypot is packagist. So by saying Drupal, you're telling it to look in the Drupal namespace, and then honeypot's the name of the module. And it automatically goes out and downloads the honeypot module for you and installs it in your local. Now this is really important. In ye olden days of Git project management, right? You download a module, you just put it in Git and forget about it. You update it, you patch it, but it's all stored in Git. Well, with Composer, you don't do that anymore. You update your inventory files, the .json and the .lock file, but you don't actually store anything from the module in Git. It continues to live out on the internet. And you download that, you have it in your local so you can work with it, but when somebody else on the project actually clones down the Git repository, they don't have to clone down tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of files as part of that Git package. They pull down the Composer inventory and then Composer does everything for you. And in my local, and I know that's a little small, but there's still dozens of files that actually make honeypot work. I can still patch it, and more, I can still ensure that everybody on my project has the exact same version of honeypot that I do. I just don't have to actually maintain the files anymore, which is really nice. So Composer is something that you're going to use daily, particularly if you're somebody that manages repositories or helps architect solutions, so like lead developer, technical architect, etc. Even if you're just doing development, anytime you go to add a new module, anytime you want to add a library, anytime you want to update your local, Composer is something that you're going to be using like daily. So getting used to it is a very, very important first step in understanding sort of how it works. I would also highly recommend that you take some time to understand how Composer and your version control system, probably Git, interact with each other. One of the major disadvantages of this, right, is that in the composer.lock file, you end up with this sometimes tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lines of code that are just all of these like very similar sort of YAML hashes. So what you're going to find is that Git does a really terrible job, of merging and managing those files for you. And that's fine as long as you only have kind of one person working with Composer at a time. But if you have 3 developers all adding new modules and all updating Composer in separate tickets, combining that stuff together can be a little messy. So understanding how it works with Git, what you need to do to get yourself out of trouble, definitely well worth your time up front. And I can't stress enough, never run Composer update. So let's talk a little bit about what a development process might look like here, right? So we've talked about a local, so you have some place to actually work. We've talked about dependency management, meaning that you now have a tool to manage all the stuff going into that workspace. And we're actually getting close to being ready to think about working with Drupal 8. So a development process is going to be much more reliant on Symfony and object-oriented PHP than perhaps you saw previously in Drupal 7, right? I mean, Drupal 7, if you wanted to go in and write a module, there's a hook for that, right? Everything's a hook. And if you ever need to know which module's hook node pre-save is going to fire first, I don't know, good luck with that. But there's a hook for everything. Well, with Drupal 8, there are still hooks, but there's not necessarily a hook for everything. And a lot more of what you're going to do is actually extending classes and like writing real code and not just shoving random functions places. This is good, right? This is much more elegant, but it's also potentially harder. I'm a largely self-trained PHP developer. I don't have a degree in computer science. That's fine, but you know, when you think about hobbyists, when you think about people that have learned to code sort of organically, this is a very different paradigm than what the Drupal community has sort of demanded of those types of people previously. So if you have Drupal developers on your team that are doing custom PHP development, if you're doing anything other than sort of site building, right, you need to make sure that there's time invested early on in learning about object-oriented PHP. The end result is going to be much better. The code will be much more powerful, but I think you'll find that the learning curve here, particularly on early projects, is going to be a little bit steeper than you might expect. One of my favorite things about this, though, is that the quality of the documentation in the code has gone up significantly. You know, I'm working on the COD module right now, the conference organizing distribution, and you know, we're doing custom entities for COD. All you have to really do is go into the Drupal core files and look at how node and taxonomy work, and there's actually documentation that tells you how they work. How do you go and do this? How do you go and do that? Yes, you can go to Drupal.org, but most of that documentation is now actually shipped with your file structure, so you can actually read about it and see how core works. Again, that's a little bit more effort, but the end result is something that's a lot more useful. If you're working on the front end, I just quickly want to call out that Drupal 8 makes it a lot easier to actually work with sort of real JavaScript applications. So if you want to do like a headless Drupal, a nearly headless Drupal, you know, that is a much simpler prospect, I think, in Drupal 8 with the new theming system. And it's also much easier to integrate SASS and other sort of modern front-end technologies. However, the biggest disadvantage there is you still need something to compile all of that code. So thinking about if you are going to work in locals, how are your team members going to know to run the right gulp commands to do those compilations? Again, BLT can help with that. But if you are going to do sort of cutting-edge front-end stuff, you want to make sure that you have that process thoroughly documented for your team, so people don't just get a bunch of raw JavaScript and SASS files that they can't do anything with. One of my favorite questions from people starting to work with Drupal 8 is, do I really need to use an IDE? Yes. I still use Sublime daily, but I don't use Sublime for development. Mostly, there's two reasons there. The first is that even though you can set up a text editor to code complete, it doesn't necessarily crawl the structure of the code. So a great example of that, right? If I'm looking at Honeypot and this says, class Honeypot settings controller extends config form base. Well, if I want to know what's actually in that base class that it's extending, in an IDE, I can just jump to the declaration of that original class and see what's there. If you're not doing PHP development, no, you probably don't care about this. If you are doing PHP development, this is something you definitely need to understand. The other big thing about an IDE is that it actually works with a debugger. You can certainly use Devel, but realistically, if you're going to be doing actual PHP development, you really need to have a debugger in Drupal 8. The number of calls on the stack in Drupal 8 I think is significantly higher than it was in Drupal 7. It's much better structured, so you can actually sequentially follow what's going on. And other than the fact that your Devel hook will probably never fire if you put it in your code, at least to begin with, it's very targeted when you use Devel, right? Devel is going to just tell you what you ask it to tell you. And the thing I found with Drupal 8 is it's much more difficult to know what you're actually looking for initially. So, if you put a breakpoint in your code, it's not only going to show you sort of what was going on, it's going to show you all of the different variables that are accessible in that particular function. Again, IDEs, debuggers, very common things, but if you don't have them as part of your sort of day-to-day workflow, you should definitely plan on spending a bit of time there. And even our front-end developers on the project I'm working on right now do use IDEs. I mean, if you're writing custom JavaScript instead of PHP, there's still a lot of advantage to having something that's really structured there. So I wanted to take just a quick moment and show you some examples of what custom module development might look like in Drupal 8. We're not going to get too deep into this, but I did just want to give you a couple of quick examples. So this is literally the simplest module that you can write for Drupal 8, right? There's nothing there. It's just a YAML file. But by telling the module that it is a type module, giving it some information, I can actually go into Drupal 8 and I can see that module here. It doesn't do anything, but it does actually show up. And doing something that looks very sort of Drupal 7-y, I can still put in a .module file. I can still do a hook form alter. I can even, just print out like a form ID, and this works actually exactly the same way in Drupal 8 that it did in Drupal 7. And a lot of the sort of entity hooks, so like pre-save, delete, form alter, etc. A lot of the stuff that you might do to sort of intercept data inline and monkey with it before it shows up on the screen or before it hits the database, that all still works exactly the same. So if you're doing any of that, the learning curve is non-existent, right? The only thing that's different is instead of just literally having the form state variable here, there's sort of an inline use statement. And personally, I would prefer to write this more like that and get this out of there. But either way is valid. But other than that, it literally works exactly the same way. And if you go out to Drupal.org and look up like hook form alter, one thing you'll find that's a little different than it was with Drupal 7 is that if you look at like the 8.2 versus the 8.3 versus the 8.4 versions of the API, these functions will change slightly. L is a great example, the link function. That function's actually already been deprecated for Drupal 8, and they have a completely different, better way of doing linking now, but the L function's still there. My advice to you is as you start looking at this stuff, definitely pay a little bit more attention to sort of what's going on in that documentation so that you understand what's being deprecated and what's not. If I add a breakpoint here and I go back into my front end, you can see that it's already tripped. So this is never ever going to resolve now. It's just going to hit this breakpoint and sit. I can see that the form ID that I grabbed is the view exposed form. If I want to look at the form that it tripped on, I can see it. And my IDE now has complete control of that website. I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint so that it'll actually run. Yeah, good. But I think, again, the key here is that having an IDE makes this process significantly easier to debug and troubleshoot what's actually happening. This is another really firm example of why you should be using a local. Having a local that is running a debugger allows your IDE to actually connect to that local and use the debugger. That can be much more challenging if you're trying to do it in a cloud environment. Last quick example I wanted to show you is sort of more of a Drupal 8 module example. So in this GovCon 3 tree here, you'll see the source folder. And the vast majority of Drupal 8 modules are going to have a source folder. And this is where any sort of custom code gets put. If you see something in like a .module or like a views.inc, you should expect that to be a hook, right? You should expect that to be very Drupal 7, Drupal 6 in the way it functions. If you see something that's sort of source or below, you should expect that to be more Drupal 8 or Symfony focused. And in this case, what I've done is I've created a plugin for views. This is something I used to do all the time. We would have just some reason to create a little custom views field, and we just very slightly altered data with a views field. And doing this in Drupal 7 was kind of a big deal. I mean, it wasn't hard, but you needed a lot of files to do it. And in Drupal 8, you literally need 2 files. You need the views.inc just to define the field, and you need this, this class. In this case, it's just a field plugin base. I'm mostly using the original. So if I jump to the declaration of this class, I can see that it itself extends some other stuff, and that's fine. But you know, out of the box, it's already doing this. Here, I've actually overridden the query because I don't want this to run a query. I'm just taking my title and changing it slightly. But this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with understanding documentation and understanding how some of the object-oriented nature of this works. Because once you understand, it's not like Drupal 7 where you just have to stumble across the right hook to do what you're trying to do. You actually can go in and look at other parts of Drupal to figure out what you need to do. Sometimes that just takes a little bit of extra time. Anyway, so if I go into views here just very quickly, I wanted a slightly more patriotic title than what Drupal would normally give you. So let me go. So instead of just test page, it now says 4 score and test page ago. Not a terribly clever change, but a very simple module nonetheless. And I think that if you can find little fun things like this that you can do, the pants module is actually hilarious. If you've never played with the pants module, it's a really good example of how to work with user data. It's out on Drupal.org. These little types of exercises, I think, will really help you understand how the new module system and the new code system work. So takeaways here. As I said, things are very Drupal-y, but not really. I mean, if you just log into Drupal 8 and work with the UI, I mean, honest to God, it looks like Drupal 7 got a facelift. I mean, it's the exact same nomenclature. Things work the same way. Some of it's in a slightly different place. You get a little bit more stuff out of the box, but other than that, it's not that different. Once you actually get down into the code, though, again, you're going to find things are a little different. So let's talk about development workflow. And you know, as a technical architect, this is something I'm really passionate about. If you invest time and effort in this early on and make sure that you have all of the right tools in place to support each step of this workflow, you're really going to help guarantee success for your team. If all you're really focused on is I just need to do some development and push it to a web server, you're probably going to run into more problems later on down the road. Right, so for me, a workflow should be, right, there should be some ticket to represent what you're doing. You should have a new Git branch for every ticket. Whatever development theming or configuration you're working on goes into that new branch. You need to write your tests and documentation based on the work you're doing, or if you're doing test-driven development, you should do that first. You do whatever commits are needed. You do a pull request. That pull request should trigger some sort of an automated build that includes automated testing. We haven't talked about testing yet. Stand by. Somebody should be doing code review that isn't the person who pushed the commit. The pull request gets merged, QA is done, and then it gets deployed into some other environment, and then you start all over again on a new ticket. We haven't talked about stuff for every single one of these steps, but a lot of these steps are, I think, things that having something like GitHub or Bitbucket, something like Jira, or even just the issue queue in GitHub, just having a lot of these sort of commonly used systems can really help with this. BLT will help with this, and understanding many of the other pieces of Drupal 8 we've talked about will help with this. Making sure that you have, and again, we're starting to step back a little bit from Drupal 8 into just sort of good practices in general. Making sure that you have good test coverage. I would argue that automated testing is even more important in Drupal 8 than it was in Drupal 7. I think that's partially because of the complexity of the code. So PHP unit is something that a lot of people probably didn't use in Drupal 7, right? I mean, because it wasn't really around. We had simple tests, but you know, unit testing your hooks was not really worthwhile in most cases. It's definitely worthwhile with the code you're going to be writing in Drupal 8. And if you're not already using some sort of continuous build process, you know, again, when you think about everything that you have to do locally that we talked about earlier in terms of moving databases, running Drupal updates, running configuration updates, you also need to make sure that your build process and your deployment process can help execute all those steps as well. So automating as much of that as early as possible, I think, will really help. A couple last topics I want to cover. Configuration management in Drupal 8. This is something that you'll sort of run into later, right? You need to have a working Drupal 8 site. You need to be doing a little bit of development before you run into configuration. In Drupal 7, the only way to really do configuration management at all was to use features. In Drupal 8, there's a couple of options, and I would say that the community is still a little up in the air on what you should use when. The core configuration management system is really powerful. It does a lot. The biggest problem with the core configuration system is that it's not really reusable. It's designed to be a snapshot of one website. So if you're trying to do like a multi-site installation, if you want to do a distribution, anything like that, core config can be really challenging. Features is kind of the same and kind of very different in Drupal 8. I don't know if there's a talk specifically on features this week, but I'm pretty sure there's a configuration management talk this week, or a couple of them. I know that Mike Potter from Phase 2 just posted a really interesting blog article on kind of how he views features and how it should be used. And that's definitely worth a read if you haven't looked at it, because he, I think, wants people to use it differently than they have been. And then config split is sort of a new-ish module for Drupal 8 that's really, really slick. We've taken to kind of using that as our de facto configuration management system in BLT, just because it lets you hyper-customize how your configuration is going to work across different environments, so dev test stage, etc. But figuring out how you want to manage configuration, and also figuring out how you're going to use your version control system to store configuration, and how you're going to work to sort of import and manage that in your project is really critical. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but that is something BLT can help with. If you're not going to use BLT, you need to find something else that helps you with this. especially if you're using that core configuration process. Because if you don't do configuration right, doing development and then supporting that development and then supporting your site over the sort of life cycle of that website can be a real problem. So let's go back to our honeypot module that we downloaded half an hour, and I'm going to turn it on. Right? So we haven't really talked at all about Drush. If you aren't familiar with Drush, you should get familiar with Drush. But this command just simply turns on the honeypot module. And after turning itself on, you can see that it installs some permissions, so on and so forth. Once the module's turned on, I can run drush cex or config export, which is the core configuration command that just dumps out all the active config. Depending on what is in your version control system already, depending how much development you've done, you may get really lucky and just have 2 files change. You may have 400 files change. It will vary slightly, depending on how big and complicated your site is and how you manage it. But in this case, the core.extension.yaml file is essentially like the on-off switch. When something's in core.extension.yaml, it gets turned on. And in this case, honeypot.settings.yaml is all of the configuration for that honeypot module. General rule of thumb, like if you go somewhere in the admin space and you make a change, that could be like to a content type, that could be a view, that could be user fields, any of that stuff will get exported in a drush cex. If you actually have nodes, if you actually have users, anything that is traditionally content, none of that gets exported. So automated testing, again, this is something that you're going to get into a little later on, but it is definitely something you should think about early. One of the arguments that I feel like I'm constantly having to make about automated testing is it's not just about what you're doing today, right? It's not saying that you're a bad developer. It's not saying that your QA person isn't good. It's not saying that your build process is bad. The problem is, what happens in 6 months when you're trying to go live and you're in a big hurry and there's a big Drupal update and you have a lot of last-minute feature development to do? How do you make sure that everything you built initially continues to work 6 months from now? How do you make sure that 2 years from now, when some other team is managing the thing that we're talking about, that they have all the correct sort of legacy and history on that project? So building automated tests into your workflow and having that be something that you do from day one with Drupal 8, I think will be much less painful than charging forward with Drupal 8 and trying to be successful with Drupal 8 and then remembering, oh crap, we need to test this, and going back later and trying to shoehorn it. I also would highly recommend, again, that you sort of look at a 3-tiered approach to automated testing. If you're doing just Drupal configuration, no custom backend, no custom front end, just use Behat. You're done. If you're doing configuration and backend development, then you should be using both Behat and PHP Unit. Use the right tool for the right job, but use both of them. And if you're doing sort of a custom front end with any sort of JavaScript framework, if you're just using Twig and SASS, probably not, but if you're going to bring in React or Ember or Angular or anything like that, you're definitely going to want to have some front-end testing for the business logic and all the functionality on the front end. And by no means does one person need to understand like all of that stuff, but you need to have a plan for how you're going to integrate that in. So again, the takeaway here is to really think about how that workflow is going to be engineered to support what you're trying to do with Drupal 8. You don't need to do this on day one, but as you do start sort of cementing your approach in terms of local, in terms of how you're going to work with dependency management, how that's going to fit into version control and builds, you definitely want to think about building out the rest of that workflow so that your team's all on the same page. So how can you get started? Like walking out of here today, you're going to have a whole plethora of sessions this week that are going to be talking about really cool stuff with Drupal 8 that you're probably going to want to play with. Literally, you can go out on the internet like right now and have a Drupal 8 site within a couple of minutes that you can play with. If you haven't looked at Simply Test Me, if you haven't played around with Aquaways Cloud stuff, please do. They're free to play with. Go do that. That'll get you immediately started with Drupal 8. But if you walk out of here with one takeaway today, it's this. Those things are really fun for playing around. They're not necessarily going to give you the tools you need to be successful long-term with Drupal 8. Come see me tomorrow at 2 o'clock if you want to hear more about BLT and Drupal VM. We're actually going to show you how to totally start from scratch, set up BLT in a brand new project, and get that rolling in less than an hour. So thank you for joining me this morning. If you have some questions, I would love to hear them. Yeah, sir.
I'm over at NASA, and one problem we've had with Drupal 8 is configuring the PIV login.
Yeah. So the question was logins with PIV cards, right? Yeah. So I haven't run into that yet. I know the LDAP module is out, but I'm not sure that that's going to help you with that situation. So the challenging thing about Drupal 8 right now is that since some of the contrib is there and some of the contrib is not, you rapidly are going to get into a place where you probably need to do some custom development for that. So no, I don't have a personal recommendation. That might be something though, if you're not part of the Drupal for Gov mailing list. The government community that actually sponsors GovCon has a mailing list, and there are peers from all over the government, both federal, state, and local. I know that question has come up for Drupal 7, but I haven't seen it for Drupal 8.
And for 7, we have a custom module.
A lot of people do, yeah. So you may just need to look at that module and work to port it over to Drupal 8. Yeah?
You said earlier on, never run Composer.
Yes.
Talk about that first.
Yeah, so the question was, I said a little while ago, never run Composer update. So if you run just a blind Composer update, it will try to update every dependency across every Composer file, across core Drupal, BLT, Lightning, contributed modules, etc. So if you run Composer update, that way lies pain. Now you can run like Composer update Drupal core, and Composer will very specifically just look at Drupal core and run an update. You can run Composer update Drupal core with dependencies, which means Symfony components, anything required to run Drupal core. But if you just run like Composer update blindly, it's going to try and update a lot of stuff that you probably don't want updated. Any other questions? Yes?
Spoke about making sure the environments are equal. So if you are developing with different web servers,
Yes.
can that help?
So the question was making sure that environments are equal, and if you're developing with different web servers, can that help? So do you mean like different like shared servers, or?
No, just like we have our own servers, so if you're making a local and you have to have a local that's Nginx and another one that's web Apache.
Yeah.
So will that to your connection?
So that's something that, yes, having locals, you can basically spin up one VM that's an Apache server to meet all the requirements for that, and then you can shut that down and spin up another one that's Nginx. And I mean, yeah, having different locals configured to sort of match different environments is one of the real strengths of running locals for sure. Yeah?
For running local environments, this probably sounds crazy in this room, but you have to have local administrator rights to be able to run it.
So you usually have to have local administrator rights to install everything. Okay. So like on a Mac, you have to install Xcode. Like I recommend Homebrew. Like there's some stuff that you need to get the ball rolling. So usually you'd need somebody from your friendly neighborhood IT group to come sit with you to get things set up. But that setup process takes less than an hour. And once you actually have everything running, you usually don't need administrative privileges to run things long term.
Drupal VM does.
Oh, Drupal VM does actually require sudo to spin things up and down. So yeah, that could be problematic for you.
And not only does it have to require you to spin up and down, it requires your local user to be the administrative user. So you can't be like another user that you sudo into and then spin it up. It actually has to be the actual local user because of the NFS.
So you can use BLT without Drupal VM. So if you set up a different local web server, many of my developers on my team right now do that, like this guy right here, and he's very successful with it. But if you don't have local admin rights, you may not want to go the Drupal VM route, but that doesn't mean you can't still use BLT. Yeah, please.
So what do you recommend for the people like me who can't get a VM installed on their government-issued laptop?
So the first thing I would recommend is I would examine why, and a lot of organizations have sort of antiquated policies on that, and yours may not change. I mean, they may not. And it may be just the fact of life that you absolutely have to go with some sort of a cloud solution. There are more and more cloud solutions that, so the Aqua pipeline stuff that I had on a couple of slides, they actually have things set up where every time you run a build, it'll actually spin off a completely separate environment for that build, and it's separated and it's not one big shared. Unfortunately, in that situation, you may have to go with some sort of shared environment. I feel your pain, but I would definitely, that is an argument, hopefully, that you can begin making sooner than later, that if you want to use a technology like Drupal and if you want to support it long term, we may need to start shifting how we view what is acceptable use internally.
Well, it took us a year to convince them that we need a new enough version of PHP.
Yep. No, like I said, that was one of my biggest blockers when I first started trying to use Drupal 8. PHP 5.3 is not going to cut it, guys. I at least need 5.6, please. And I mean, that took 6 months. So, like I said, I feel your pain. There are many, many government organizations that do support a workflow like this. Again, if you're not on the Drupal for Gov mailing list, I would suggest joining it. That is something that, hey, how did you get this through at your organization? A lot of, hey, they're doing this over here. Sometimes that can really help you with that argument and help you fight for that cause. Please.
What's the address?
Off the top of my head, I do not. I will try to get them to talk about it during one of the keynotes so they can, I think Drupal for Gov, drupalforgov.us is the website. I don't remember exactly what you need to do to get on the mailing list, but I think you can request to join from the actual Drupal for Gov site. One thing real quick before people leave, if this is your first GovCon, the schedule tends to change a little bit throughout the week, just based on room sizes. So time slots are always the same, but you might walk into a balcony and realize that the session you were looking for isn't there anymore. So just pull up the schedule periodically on your phone or on the web and just make sure that where you're going is still where you think it is. Any other last questions before we wrap up? Great. Thanks, guys. I'll hang out for a few.